What Is It Wednesdays, presented by the Danbury Library. Each time we meet, we're going to look at an interesting find from nature and see if we can guess what it is. Now, this week's find is going to be fairly easy to guess, at least partially, because it looks like this. Now, what does this look like? It's like a pine cone, right? Yeah, but it's not an average pine cone. It's a very big pine cone. Have you ever seen a pine cone this big? I bet not, huh? This is a massive pine cone. It's not even that it's large, it's also very heavy. So I'm having a bit of a hard time holding it up. But as you can see, it's very, very big. It also has lots of sharp, pointy things. Can you see these guys? Get them nice and pointy, aren't they? And they are kind of sharp, so I have to be careful when I'm holding on to it. And this type of pine cone comes from a very specific type of tree. The tree is only found naturally in a very few places on Earth. And this type of pine cone is a record-breaking pine cone. Yes, it is. It's one of the largest types of pine cones in the world. We know it's very, very large. It's also pretty heavy, and it's got very sharp points all on the end of its scales. And it's a record-breaking pine cone. Do you know what it is? If you'd like to do some research and guess on your own, you can stop the video here and come back when you have an answer. But if you'd like to know the answer right now, keep watching because I'll tell you in 3, 2, 1. So, do you know what this week's mystery item is? Yes, it is a pine cone, but a very special pine cone. This is a coulter cone, the heaviest species of pine cone on Earth. And as you can see, I'm holding on to it, but I'm trying to be very gentle, and I may actually have to put it down because it's starting to get a little heavy. You notice all these little white bits hanging on here? All of that is tree sap. So it still has some sap on it because of how large these cones are. You see, when we take pine cones inside the house to keep them, we usually bake them a little bit in the oven, and this dries up all the sap so we don't get sticky stuff all over our hands. But coulter pine cones are so massive that we actually can't really stick them easily in an oven. There's a good chance they might catch on fire. So as a result, I have to wait for the sap to dry naturally. And it's still a little damp on the bottom, which my hands are kind of sticky at the moment. So I put it down because, as I said, it's very heavy. And as I said before, these are the heaviest pine cones in the world. So they're record-breaking pine cones by weight. But how much do they weigh? Well, coulter pine cones can reach weights of up to 11 pounds. Can you imagine a pine cone that heavy? And the thing is, this is a medium-sized coulter pine cone. They can actually get bigger than this and weigh that 11 pounds. Because this guy, he's pretty much close to 6 pounds. So even though this is a massive pine cone, they can get even bigger. One thing we also may have noticed with them, and part of the reason why I put it down, is there are those sharp, pointy bits. You might be able to see some really close here. You see those guys? Those little parts that stick out? Well, on a pine cone, the bits that kind of flare out are called scales. And the scales are there to protect the seeds, which are buried into the middle of the pine cone. But the thing is, lots of animals like pine cone seeds, things like birds and squirrels, and they can easily take a pine cone and rip up the scales to get to the seeds. Well, the coulter tree, what it wants to do is protect those seeds as much as possible. So it's developed these spiky points, which make getting into the scales to get to those seeds much more difficult. Each coulter cone can carry up to 150 seeds. That's a lot, right? But again, we're talking a massive pine cone here. Thanks to their weight and these talon-like sharp bits on their scales, coulter cones have been given the ominous nickname of widowmakers. These massive cones have been known to fall out of trees suddenly. Anyone working in areas where there are coulter pines, such as loggers, are expected to wear hard hats because something this big and this heavy with this much spikes falling from a tall tree onto your head, not a good thing. These cones are so heavy that when the pine tree first begins to develop pine cones, this happens when the tree is about 10 to 15 years old, the cones actually have to grow out of the tree trunk itself and not on the branches, which is where we normally see pine cones. And the reason for that is these cones are too heavy for the tree to support at that age. The limbs just can't handle them, they'll actually snap. It's only when the tree is fully mature that these massive pine cones can actually start growing on the branches like we expect to see pine cones do. We know the pine cones come from trees. They come from pine trees, right? They do. So this type of cone comes from the coulter pine tree, a species that is native to Southern California and northern Mexico along the Pacific Ocean coastline. Now these trees grow quite large, from 33 to 70 feet tall, and they can have a trunk that measures 1 meter or 3 feet in diameter. That's a big tree. You probably wouldn't even be able to hug that because it's so massive. And their needle-like leaves, well, they can reach lengths of up to 12 inches or 1 whole foot. That's a big pine needle, right? Yeah. Still, despite their massive size and them having the heaviest pine cones on Earth, the coulter tree is not the tallest type of tree out there. They're not. That honor goes to the California redwood, which can grow to a staggering 379 feet tall with a trunk up to 29.3 feet in diameter. That's a big tree. In fact, the California redwoods are some of the oldest living creatures on the earth, living for thousands of years. Amazing, right? Yet, despite how massive the California redwoods grow, their cones are much smaller. Look at that. That's a tiny cone, right? It's even smaller than the ones we have around here. And it's certainly much smaller than the coulter pine. Look at that. It's pretty amazing, huh? That something so massive can come from something so small as this. Thank you for joining me this week on What Is It Wednesday. I hope you've enjoyed learning about these massive pine cones, the world's heaviest cones. And I hope it's encouraged you to keep an eye out when you're out in nature and see if you can see some pine cones and what kind of cones you can find. Can you see all the different sizes? How many varieties can you see? We've got quite a few in the area. Admittedly, nothing as big as these guys, but some very impressive cones nonetheless. So when you're out wandering the woods, keep your eyes open and see what you can find. I'll see you again next week for another amazing find from nature. Until then, happy exploring and stay curious. Bye, everyone.